Hello, everyone. This is North Hempstead Town Supervisor Judi Bosworth, and I wanted to thank you for joining us for this important panel discussion that we're hosting as part of the town's celebration for Black History Month. This month honors the significant role that African Americans have made in shaping our history and our future. Today's discussion will focus on the 2021 Black History Month theme, Black Family, Representation, Identity, and Diversity. We will have distinguished panelists who will speak about these topics in depth. The town of North Hempstead is committed to honoring the legacy and contributions of African Americans. We're exceedingly fortunate for these trailblazers who came before us. I'd now like to introduce Council Member Viviana Russell, who will be moderating tonight's panel with our distinguished guests.
Thank you for joining us for this year's 2021 North Hempstead Black History Month celebration. Our theme for this year is the Black family, and we will be talking about the Black family from the point of representation, identity, and diversity. With us today, our panelists, we have Mr. Herb Boyd, who is an American author, journalist, and activist. We have Elaine Gross, who is the president of Erase Racism. Erica Hill, who is a principal consultant for Vision Street Research, LLC. And Marvin McMoore, who is a senior political digital strategist. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. So we're going to. You're welcome. We're going to delve into our questions. The first question under the topic of representation as it relates to the Black family is, how do you define representation and what does that mean to you? I'm going to start with Erica Hill.
Thank you. So for me, when I think about representation, I think about having a presence in some sort of organization, in a workplace. I mean, if it's on a board, but having a presence that is both a mix of race, gender, ideology, and merely having a voice for a particular group of people. So if I think about myself as a Black woman, it's having representation. So being able to see myself when I look at these places. So when I go into a workplace, do I see someone that I could aspire to be, or that looks like me in those places? Am I represented? And what I have found a lot of times is I don't see myself. So I try to see how I can make a pathway to be part of the representation or to speak out about how we can improve representation in that particular place.
Thank you. Mr. Boyd?
Well, I think she's absolutely spot on in terms of it's a collective look. It's not so much personal or individual. It's a collective aspect. You look around a room and you can see, if you're reflected, you can feel you're there. Just because you're there doesn't mean, like, you talk about a collective representation or as an individual. As an individual, that's a kind of a self-determining thing, as opposed to a collective. That's a shared situation. And would you look around a situation, for example, if you look at from a political standpoint, and there's a rally, there's a demonstration going on, and you can feel that you are part of this here group or gathering. Or in a classroom, for example, you walk into a classroom and you look around the class. If you look around the classroom, you're the only one there, then you have like an obligation. You have a dual obligation of not only representing symbolically, your whole company, your group, your race, what have you, your gender. But if it's other people there, you can feel that I don't have that responsibility, obligation entirely. It's a shared one. I can look around a room and others can help give that representation solidification.
Thank you. Elaine?
When I think of representation, I'm looking for both a range and diversity, but I'm also looking at power. And so just seeing some faces that kind of look like me and not knowing what they're doing or how they are situated. It's not until I know that I can feel comfortable about the representation. So is there a diversity of thought? Is there a diversity of roles? And most importantly, does there seem to be a sense of power? So when you see some of the television shows, the Black person is the buddy to the person that's in the lead, or the trusted friend, or something like that. And to me, that's not, we have to be, not always, but we have to be able to be front and center. Our opinions have to be valued. Those are all the things that go into representation.
You touched on something that we're going to come back to when it comes to power and having that representation and what that means. Marv?
Absolutely. So to me, representation means an entity, whether it's a government or business, reflecting the population it's trying to serve. So that if you have, for example, a government representing a population that's 60% diverse, that government ought to strive to look like that population. And as Elaine said, it's at all levels of that entity. So we don't want to see diversity overrepresented at the bottom of that entity. We want to see it at all levels of that government or business. And why it's so important is that we know, and studies have shown that, when we have diversity, the product is better. If it comes to businesses and their bottom line, if they have diversity reflected, they're going to have a better product, they're going to have better marketing, and therefore, we all succeed in that business, or that government succeeds when there's diversity at the table and at all levels.
Great answer. So, in your opinion, does a Black family have equitable representation in their community, government, workplaces, and in the media in our current state of, whether it's social media or advertisement, television, film, political office? Do you believe that there's equitable representation in those areas?
I currently think that we do not see representation across all spectrum, whether that is in media, arts, culture, government, or business. I think that, the past year has really, brought those sentiments and those facts to fruition, that we, as the Black community and as Black families, we're really underrepresented in facing systematic oppression and obstacles and barriers. And it's not due to lack of talent or lack of trying. I think it's those barriers that are the legacy of us, trying to, push these barriers, but obviously racism pushing us out.
I certainly agree with Marvin on that point. And I would say that the full spectrum of who we are needs to be part of what is there. And sometimes we really get caught short in terms of, we have accomplishments, and we have struggles. We have happy times, and we have sorrowful times. And so I really would hope to see all of that.
So much of it is contextual. In what context are you talking about? In some places we're overrepresented. In some places we're just invisible, absent entirely. So it's a relative situation. It has to be, in what context are you talking about? In some places where our voice is limited, muted, not represented, and it has to be raised, it has to be intensified. We have to make our presence known. The Black family, for example, you look at some of the various studies that they do, and you talk about dysfunctionality, we come up on the misery index, as the Urban League does each year. All that's very dismal. It's very dismal for us. We had looking at better situations in which we'd like to be, a little bit more represented in some places where we don't necessarily need to be counted in that context because it's a negative one. So you're looking for a positive situation in terms of the Black family, in terms of power, which I think is the what Marvin is making reference to earlier. I think it's a significant discussion to have there, and probably a little bit more than just a quick answer to it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So let's kind of delve into that a little bit. So we talk about having a seat at the table. What does that mean, having a seat at the table? It's not just our presence, but how do you think we can exercise the power or the responsibility that comes with having a seat at the table?
I think part of it, because now I think as a result of what happened last year, more people may be apt to invite us to the table. But I think to echo Marvin and Elaine's point is, do we actually have the power to make a decision or influence decision making? Because just putting our names on a roster is not having a seat at the table. And a lot of times that unfortunately is the way that we may be presented, to say, they're represented, they're on a committee, they're someplace, but when you dig down deep to see if they actually have any true power to influence the decision making, they don't have any, or we don't have any. So to have a true seat at the table involves actually being able to be part of the decision making process, versus just being kind of like a puppet, almost like somebody just exists.
Right.
It's not, I don't want to be there just for existence. I want to be there to make an impact. And that to me is having a true sense at the table.
Yeah, and to echo what Erica said, I think diversity is so important, but the other piece of that is inclusion. Are the folks, who are diverse voices included in all decision making? But I think it's also important to make sure that, we have, the right sort of diversity that's accountable to their community, and also, pushing progress for the community in those positions. So I think that we've seen time and time again, a Black person or, a person of diversity being placed in a position only in face only, or working against the interests of that community. So I think, it's very nuanced, and, that accountability piece and that, inclusion piece is very, very essential to thinking about this. And, I think, obviously there's been great progress, in the past, if you look at the past quarter century, and that's, hats off to, folks who came before me and before my generation, working towards it. We have representation that's been improving, in family portrayals, such as Blackish, or, some other TV shows, and in Hollywood. And, we've had a Black president. Now we have a Black woman as vice president. So there has been, improvement, but I think that, we're at that point that we have to be nuanced and really dig deep and, hold that power to account, and to be included.
And I'm concerned that we are, having a seat implies that you've been invited somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be at the early stage where we're helping to create the taste and what is the agenda. And so sometimes all the important decisions have already been made, and then we're invited after that. And that's not where we want to be.
I agree. So in your opinion, what social policies that impact the Black family do you think need to change, will change, or is required to change to move us forward as far as having a seat at the table or having greater representation in our communities, in government, the workplace, in media? What do you think are the things that need to change from a social perspective?
The prism that, I view most of this, and as we live in a capitalist society, I think economics is the root of it all. And if you look, at everything from, median household wealth of a white family being 10 times the amount of a Black household, if you look at access to credit, home ownership, a whole slew of economic indicators, we as a community, as a Black community, are systematically oppressed and behind white families. So I think in order for us to build some true power and build wealth and representation, we at first have to have social policies that address the economic status of our community. If we look at COVID, for example, we're obviously overrepresented and just the contraction of the disease, and our family members have gotten at alarmingly higher rates. They've died at higher rates, and even more so, the economic indicators. The jobs report from December showed that there was 140,000 jobs lost. The majority of those were Black women who held the brunt of the pandemic and the economic impact of that. So I think the first step, to start to achieve equity is to look at social policies that will reduce this gap in economics.
I find it to be a challenge to answer that question because every aspect of policy needs to be put under a sharp light to identify the ways in which those policies are perpetuating white supremacy and the benefits that go to white people versus providing avenues for inclusion and advancement for Black people in particular. And so you can name a policy and we could say, yeah, that one needs extra scrutiny. That one does. They all do. And that's because structural racism is so embedded throughout our society. And there really hasn't been a kind of serious investigation, if you will, analysis, and then action.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just dealing with around the edges. And so at the root of the policies, many of them have to be turned on their head completely in order for us to really make progress.
Interesting. So do you think that there's been any significant changes to policies, I would say, in the last, I won't even go back as far as 10 years, the last 4 years, 5 years?
Well, the thing about policies is what happens on the implementation side.
Right.
So fair housing is an area that I know a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
The number of times that the federal government has said, okay, well, now we're going to deal with housing discrimination. And then you have some decades go by. All right, well, now we're going to deal with it. We won't have this problem anymore. And then, you have a new law passed and they say, okay, well, now we're going to deal with it. The issue is it never really gets dealt with. When the Supreme Court had a case in 1957 saying that the federal government could no longer, discriminate with the racial covenants, et cetera, what happened? The federal government continued to fund, including Levittown, continued to fund projects that had racial covenants in the deeds. It was like, ignore the Supreme Court case.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to go until 1968 when the Fair Housing Law was passed, to supposedly say, okay, now it's the law of the land. Now we're really going to be serious about it. And then we had to have amendments to give it teeth. And then, as we know from the Newsday investigation that they sent the results out in 2019, people are still doing the same old thing without enforcement. So it's really hard to say, have there been significant policies? Because there have been a variety of new laws or various policies or things of that nature. And I don't want to say that there's no change, but we haven't made the kind of fundamental change so that when we say this is the law of the land. We actually mean it and we enforce it.
Yeah. To add to what she was saying, I almost feel that we take 2 steps forward and almost 5 steps back, right? So it's hard to look at, a course of a few years, when there have been successes, but there's also been failures. But one of the things that, I tend to say and write about is that, one of Long Island's greatest exports is the segregated suburb and the model of how to do it. And as Elaine was saying, it's so pervasive and omnipresent in our society that it's hard to, overcome. And almost every single policy needs to be looked at through the lens that's not only, good, but actively anti-racist in order to root, to root out, what we're now facing.
And what I would just add to that is when you say like things that have been done in the last couple of years, I mean, even in the last year, even the Community Reinvestment Act was looked at again, but the way that was being looked at was to our disadvantage. They were unbundling things that were supposed to be put in place to help communities, particularly communities of color, and to put more regulations around what financial institutions were doing to the betterment of communities. And I mean, that continues to be an ongoing conversation. So while yes, many people would agree it needed to be revisited, people weren't asked for it to be revisited. So they would
Tear it apart.
Yeah, they would tear it apart and make it easier for people to kind of say like, okay, check mark, I did this. Okay, great. We can move on. I get a good stamp of approval for what I did in this community. Yet the community is saying that they've walked into institutions and been denied loans, even though they had great credit, or because of their zip codes, for some reason, they weren't allowed the same access or were given higher rates. So it still continues to be an issue, even if things get re-examined, because they kind of, that process was even done very quickly, and some people didn't even realize it was happening. Like when they were calling for comment and things, it was happening and then it happened. And it's still an issue. So there's definitely more work to be done.